The jet smelled like money. Not the kind of money that ordinary people carried in their wallets or counted at the end of a long shift. This was the kind of money that had its own gravity, its own temperature, its own silence. The kind of money that made people lower their voices without knowing why. The leather seats were the color of warm cream, hand-stitched by craftsmen in Milan, who never asked who would sit in them. The lighting was dim, amber, intimate. Crystal glasses caught the light from every angle. Fresh orchids, pale lavender, were arranged in slim vases, bolted discreetly into the mahogany panels along the cabin wall. The whole aircraft hummed with a low, controlled power. Engines warming on the tarmac at Seoul's most private terminal, the kind of terminal that didn't appear on any public map. Outside, rain was beginning to threaten, not falling yet, but present, hanging in the gray Seoul sky like a held breath. Inside, the cabin crew moved with practiced efficiency, checking trays, adjusting napkins, confirming the temperature of the chilled beverages. There were 3 of them on this flight. Soo Yeon at the front, Jin Ho managing the bar cart, and the third, a last-minute replacement. A woman who had received the call barely 4 hours ago, who had stared at her phone for a long moment before exhaling and accepting the assignment because she needed the overtime, because her son's school fees were due, because she had stopped letting fear make her decisions a long time ago. Her name badge said, Amara. She was checking the serving cart at the rear of the aircraft when the forward door opened. She didn't look up immediately. She was counting. Miniature bottles of sparkling water, napkins folded into neat triangles, the specific brand of dark chocolate the charter profile had requested in triplicate. She was precise in her work. She had always been precise. Precision was what happened when your life depended on leaving no loose ends, no trail, no reason for anyone to look twice at a woman just doing her job. She heard the footsteps before she saw anything. Heavy. Deliberate. The kind of footsteps that didn't negotiate with the floor beneath them. And then, the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. The way the other crew members seemed to straighten imperceptibly. The way the air itself rearranged. Amara looked up. The tray in her hands tilted. She caught it. One of the crystal glasses slid an inch toward the edge, and she stopped it with her palm, pressing it flat, pressing everything flat, pressing her face into something smooth and professional and completely, utterly empty. Because Kang Min-jae had just walked onto the plane. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply spent 2 years shrinking the memory of him down to something manageable, something she could tuck into the back of her mind and walk away from on ordinary Tuesday mornings. He wore a black coat that fell to his knees, unbuttoned, moving with him like a shadow that had decided to become fabric. His jaw was sharper. The lines around his eyes were new. He had always been striking in the way that dangerous things were striking. Not inviting, not warm, but absolutely impossible to look away from. 3 bodyguards flanked him, and behind them, 2 men in suits carrying documents, already whispering, already working. Min-jae's eyes swept the cabin. Habit. He had been doing it since he was 19 years old, reading every room he entered for threat, for exit, for anything that didn't belong. His eyes found her, and stopped. For exactly 3 seconds, Kang Min-jae, the man they called the Black Dragon, the man whose name alone had ended careers and silenced entire rooms across 4 countries, stood completely, utterly still. Amara held his gaze for one of those seconds. 1. Then she looked down at her tray, straightened the glass that didn't need straightening, and walked toward him down the aisle with her shoulders squared and her face arranged into the professional warmth she had trained herself to wear like armor. She stopped 1 respectful step away. She smiled the smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had practiced that smile in bathroom mirrors at 5 a.m. in 3 different cities across 2 years, and she had perfected it. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She had not known, until this moment, whether it would. Min-jae said nothing. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes moved across her face slowly, the way someone reads words they cannot quite believe are real, reading them again, and again, and again. "Sir?" One of his aides touched his arm lightly. "We should be seated before—" "I know," Min-jae said quietly. He didn't look at the aide. He didn't look away from Amara. She gestured toward his seat with practiced elegance. "If you'll follow me, I can show you to—" "I know where my seat is," he said. Still quiet. Still not moving. Amara. The sound of her name in his voice after 2 years was the most violent thing she had ever experienced, and nothing touched her. Not one muscle in her face moved. She had survived worse. She had survived him. "Your beverage preferences are already noted from your profile," she said smoothly. "But please don't hesitate to let me know if there's anything you'd like changed." She turned and walked back toward the rear of the aircraft. Her hands, hidden from view, were trembling so hard she pressed them flat against her thighs. 2 years. 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days since she had last been in the same room as Kang Min-jae. And the universe, the ironic, merciless, completely unreasonable universe, had decided that her co-worker Ji-yeon's sudden fever and her own need for overtime pay and the anonymous charter booking that had come through the agency without a client name attached, all of these things should conspire to put her on this aircraft, in this cabin, 30,000 feet from the ground, with nowhere to go. She pushed through to the small galley at the rear and stood there for exactly 12 seconds with her eyes closed. 12 seconds was all she allowed herself. She had learned that, too, in the months after she disappeared. You could fall apart, but you had to set a timer. You could feel the terror and the grief and the devastation, but you had to set a timer. And when it went off, you packed it away, and you went back to work, because there was a little boy waiting for you, and he needed his mother whole. 12 seconds. She opened her eyes, exhaled, went back to work. He watched her the entire flight. He didn't pretend otherwise. His aides eventually stopped trying to show him documents. His bodyguards had learned, over years, not to comment on where their employer's attention went. The cabin was quiet, except for the ambient hum of altitude and the occasional soft clink of service. Min-jae sat in his seat and watched Amara work. She was brilliant at it. That surprised him, though he couldn't have said why it should. She had always been competent. She had always moved through the world with a kind of deliberate grace that he had found, privately, more attractive than anything he'd encountered before or since. She had been studying international business when they met. She had been writing a paper on the structural vulnerabilities of Pacific trade agreements, sitting in a cafe in Itaewon with 3 highlighters and a cold coffee, when he had sat down across from her and asked, with no introduction whatsoever, what she was reading. She had looked up at him and said, "Something you wouldn't understand." And she had been right. He had not understood trade agreements at all. He had understood, in that moment, that he would need to learn. He had learned. He had learned everything she was willing to teach him, about herself, about the world she came from, about what it meant to be fully seen by another person rather than feared. And in return, without meaning to, without realizing it was happening until it was already irreversible, he had shown her himself. Not the version of himself that the world knew. The real one. The one that existed only in the dark, quiet spaces of his apartment at 3 a.m. The one that sometimes sat very still and was not fearless at all. She had loved that version of him. He had been certain of it. And then she had vanished. The file on his desk had been waiting when he returned from a meeting. Photographs, grainy but unmistakable. Amara in a private restaurant, across a table from Lee Dong-gun. Lee Dong-gun, whose family had spent 3 generations trying to dismantle everything Min-jae's grandfather had built. Lee Dong-gun, who had made 2 separate attempts on Min-jae's life in the 18 months prior. The rage he had felt looking at those photographs was the cleanest, most terrible emotion he had ever experienced, because it wasn't just anger. Under it, buried beneath it, was something far worse. It was grief. It was the grief of a man who had believed completely and foolishly that one person in the entire world was not capable of betraying him. He had confronted her that night. He had not been kind. He had never been kind when he was hurt. He had learned cruelty as a child and refined it into a weapon. And when she stood in front of him with her eyes wide and her voice shaking, saying, "Let me explain. Please, Min-jae. Let me explain." He had cut through every word she tried to offer. He had been brutal. He had been the version of himself he had never wanted her to see. She had cried. He had watched her cry and felt nothing, because he had sealed every feeling he possessed behind stone in order to survive the conversation. She had left. He had told himself it was her choice. 3 days later, he had started to wonder. By the end of the week, he was already beginning to question the photographs. Too convenient, too perfectly timed, too precisely calibrated to wound him in the specific way that would make him irrational. He had begun pulling at threads, quietly, carefully, and every thread he pulled had led him toward the same person. But by then, Amara was already gone. He had searched. He had used every resource at his disposal, every contact, every favor owed, every threat available. And a man like Min-jae had more of all 3 than most governments. And he had found nothing. For 2 years, he had found nothing. She had disappeared with the professionalism of someone who had planned it, or the desperation of someone who had run so hard and so far that she had slipped completely through every net he cast. Now she was 30 feet away, pouring sparkling water into a crystal glass, and he could not stop looking at her. He noticed that she no longer wore her ring. He noticed that she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever he was near. A small, involuntary withdrawal, the body language of someone who had learned to be afraid. He noticed, because he had always noticed everything about her, that her hands shook slightly when she set his glass down. He said nothing. He waited. He had learned, at great cost, that some things cannot be rushed. The turbulence hit somewhere over the East China Sea. It was the kind that came without warning, a sudden, violent drop, and then the aircraft shuddering laterally in a way that made even the bodyguards grip their armrests. The overhead alert chimed. Amara, who had been moving from the galley with a tray, lurched sideways as the floor tilted beneath her. She was going down. She knew it in the half-second before it happened. The tray going one way, her body going another, and no good outcome available. She closed her eyes. She didn't hit the floor. A hand caught her waist. A strong arm pulled her upright in one smooth motion, and for a disoriented moment, she was pressed against a chest she would have recognized anywhere. The specific height of it. The warmth. The way it felt like standing next to something immovable. The turbulence steadied. She stepped back immediately. 1 step, 2 steps, putting professional distance between them. "Thank you," she said, without looking at him. "Amara, I'm fine. Thank you, sir. I'll just—" She was already reaching for the tray, which had landed with its contents mercifully unbroken, her movements fast and efficient, her face turned away. "Don't." His voice was very quiet. "Don't do that. Don't perform for me." She straightened and looked at him then. Really looked at him for the first time since he had boarded, and the thing she saw in his expression, not anger, not coldness, but something raw and exhausted and desperately controlled, nearly destroyed her composure completely. "Please," she said, very quietly, "don't touch me." Something moved across his face like a shadow. "Understood," he said. He picked up the unbroken glass from the floor and set it on the cart. Then he turned and walked back to his seat, and Amara stood alone in the middle of the aisle for a moment, with her eyes closed and her jaw tight. She was fine. She was fine. She had always been fine. She wasn't fine. She was at the rear galley when he appeared. She hadn't heard him come. He moved quietly for a large man, always had. And she turned to find him standing in the narrow entrance, filling it, his hands in his coat pockets, and his face arranged into something careful and controlled. "We need to talk," said. "We don't. You're on my plane. I'm doing my job. Amara." Something cracked in his voice, just slightly. Just enough. "I've been looking for you for 2 years." She set down the bottle in her hands precisely, with a small, controlled click. "You shouldn't have. Tell me why you left." "You know why I left." "I know what I believed at the time," he said. "I no longer believe it." She turned to face him fully. 2 years of practiced calm, and she could feel it fracturing at the edges, all of it, every carefully maintained wall, because he was standing there looking at her like that, like she was something he had lost and couldn't stop grieving, and she had not prepared for that. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for coldness. She had prepared for the version of him that had stood across from her in their apartment and said terrible, cutting things while she begged him to listen. She had not prepared for this. "You chose your empire over me," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You looked at those photographs, and you chose to believe them. You didn't ask questions. You didn't wait. You made a decision in about 4 minutes, and I knew." Her voice wavered for one syllable, and she crushed it flat. "I knew in that moment that it would always be like that. That no matter what we built, your world would always come first, and my word would never be enough." Min-jae was very still. "After everything," she continued, because she had started, and now she couldn't stop. "After everything I gave up to be in your life, the judgment, the fear, the isolation, and then you looked at me like I was one of your enemies, like I was something to be managed." She shook her head. "So, no. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I finally understood that love wasn't going to be enough to protect me in your world." Silence. Outside, the sky had darkened. The amber light of the cabin made his face look older than she remembered. "I know," he said finally. Low, rough at the edges. "I know what I did. And I know there is nothing I can say tonight that will undo it." He paused. "But I need you to know. The photographs were fabricated. I discovered it within a week of you leaving." "Hyunwoo." She laughed. A short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "Of course it was Hyunwoo." He looked at her sharply. "I figured that out 6 months later," she said. "From a distance. I'm good at connecting dots when my life depends on it." She met his eyes. "There were men, Min-jae, the night I left. Masked men. They were waiting outside the building." Her voice was completely flat, and she watched every word land on him like a separate blow. "I barely got away. I ran to the first place I could think of, and I kept running, because I believed—" She stopped. "You believed I sent them," he said. "Yes." The words sat between them for a long moment. "I didn't," he said. "I swear to you. I would have. In the years before you, perhaps I was capable of many things, but not that. Never you." He exhaled. "It was Hyunwoo. I know that now. He wanted you gone, and he wanted me destabilized. He wanted—" He stopped himself. "It doesn't matter what he wanted. What matters is what happened." "What happened," Amara said carefully, "is that I spent 2 years building a life. Alone." She held his gaze. "Alone, Min-jae. Taking every shift I could get. Moving every few months. never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe, because I didn't know if you were still looking, and I didn't know if the men Hyunwoo sent would find me again. Her hands at her sides were curled into loose fists. You want me to just... what? Have this conversation and then go back to before? You think 2 years of running disappears because you found me on a plane? No, he said. I don't think that. Then what do you want from me? He was quiet for a long moment. The truth, he said. Just the truth. All of it. Whatever you're still not telling me. The plane shuddered gently, a small, barely there movement, and in the silence of the rear galley, Amara's phone, tucked in the small pocket of her uniform jacket, buzzed. She glanced at it automatically. Her whole body changed. Min-jae saw it happen, the sudden tension in her shoulders, the way her breath quickened, the complete shift in her expression from guarded to something much closer, to afraid. I need to take this, she said. Amara. She was all ready, stepping past him, pressing the phone to her ear, turning away. Hey, baby, she said softly. Her voice, the voice she had been holding rigid and professional for hours, went completely different. Warm. Soft. Helpless in the way that love made a person helpless. I know it's late, sweetheart. Is Mrs. Park there with you? Yes. No, Mama will be home tomorrow morning, okay? I promise. Yes, I promise. A quiet laugh, genuine, the first one he had heard from her in 2 years. I know. I love you too. Go back to sleep, Eli. Min-jae stood very still. She hung up and turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not in all the time she had known him. Not across every version of him she had witnessed. He looked, for the first time in the entire conversation, like he was the one without armor. Eli, he repeated. The color in her face had changed. Amara. His voice was barely above a whisper. How old is the child? She said nothing. How? Old. Min-jae, tell me. The silence stretched long and terrible between them. She could see him calculating, could see the math being done behind his eyes, and she knew that there was no version of this conversation where the numbers didn't add up. 18 months, she said. He sat down. Not in a seat. There was no seat nearby. He simply sat down on the edge of the galley counter and put both hands flat on the surface and stared at nothing for a very long moment. You were pregnant, he said. Not a question. When you left, you were already pregnant. I found out the same night. Her voice was quiet, steady, because one of them had to be. The test was in my bag when everything happened. I was going to tell you. That was why I came home early from the library that night, because I wanted to tell you, and instead, I destroyed everything before you could. Yes. The word was so small in the air between them. Just 2 letters and the complete wreckage of 2 years. He pressed his fingers over his eyes, a gesture so private, so deeply unguarded, that she looked away. His name is Eli, she said after a moment. Elijah Kang. I gave him your name. She paused. I was angry at you for a long time, but I wanted him to have something of you. I didn't know yet what was real and what wasn't, and I was angry. But She stopped. He has your eyes. Something fractured in Min-jae's expression that she couldn't name and couldn't look at directly. I have missed 18 months, he said. Yes. He doesn't know I exist. He knows he has a father. I didn't. She shook her head. I wasn't going to tell him you were dead. I wasn't going to lie to him about that. Min-jae was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough in a way she had heard only once before. The night his grandfather died, the only night she had ever seen him grieve openly. I want to meet him, he said. I know. And I want to fix this. You can't fix 2 years, Min-jae. No, He looked at her. But I can spend the next 20 trying. She found him in the forward lounge 40 minutes later. She almost didn't go. She stood in the galley arguing with herself, aware that she was making decisions at altitude that she might feel differently about on the ground, aware that the strange, pressurized intimacy of a private jet was not the best environment for clear thinking. But she had also spent 2 years making every decision alone, and she was tired. She was so profoundly, bone-deeply tired. He was sitting with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. He looked up when she entered. She sat across from him, folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me about Hyunwoo," she said. "All of it. What you know." He told her. He told her without flinching, without softening, without the careful editing he would have applied to protect her from the ugliest parts. He told her the way someone tells a person they have decided to stop lying to, even when the truth is an indictment of themselves. The photographs and his investigation, the patterns he had discovered, the assassination attempt that he now understood had been ordered not by him, but by his most trusted second-in-command, a man he had known since childhood, a man he had defended and promoted and trusted with things he trusted to no one else. Amara listened. She did not interrupt. "He's still in your organization?" she asked when he finished. "For now. He doesn't know what I know. I've been..." He paused. "I've been careful. Building a case. I needed it to be airtight before I moved. And now?" "And now," he said, "you're back, which means the timeline changes." He looked at her directly. "He will find out. He has informants in my staff that I haven't fully cleared yet. When he discovers you're on this flight, he'll move." "Yes." She absorbed this. "So what happens when we land?" "I handle it." "That's not an answer." "Amara, I've been handling my own safety for 2 years," she said, quietly but firmly. "Don't talk to me like I'm someone who needs to be shielded from information. Tell me the actual plan." He looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. A small, private thing, almost like recognition, like a man remembering exactly why he had fallen in love with a particular person. "We land at the private airstrip in 40 minutes, he said. "I have a secondary team meeting us there. Hyunwoo doesn't know that route. I changed it this morning. If he moves, he'll move at the primary facility, and my people will be there waiting." He paused. "You'll be taken somewhere safe before..." The aircraft lurched. Not turbulence, something different. A controlled, tactical shift in altitude, and then the pilot's voice, clipped, professional, stripped of the warm, scripted phrasing of normal flight communication. "Mr. Kang, we have a situation at the arranged landing site, advising alternate approach. Please secure all passengers." Min-jae was already on his feet. He turned to Amara. "Stay here. Don't you dare." "Amara." He took her face briefly in both hands, just for a second, not long enough for her to pull away, long enough to make her look at him. "I have spent 2 years terrified that something happened to you. Please, stay here." She stayed. The airstrip was dark and rain slicked when they landed, and the armed men were already there. 5 of them, emerging from the shadows of the cargo hangars, with the particular efficiency of people who had been waiting. Min-jae's bodyguards moved in the opposite direction with equal efficiency, and for 40 seconds, the tarmac was a controlled chaos of shouted commands and the hard percussion of conflict that Amara could hear from inside the aircraft, where she stood pressed against the interior wall next to a fire extinguisher she had picked up because it was the nearest available object. She was not, it turned out, capable of staying in the lounge. She had made it as far as the aircraft door, which she did not open. She was not reckless, but she stood there and watched through the small porthole window, her heart slamming against her ribs, until she saw Min-jae, still standing, still moving, directing his men with the controlled authority of someone who had been doing this since before she knew what the word Mafia meant. He was intercepted before she could exhale. Not by the armed men outside. By a figure who had been on the aircraft all along, had been on the aircraft the entire flight, in the private communications bay at the front, and who now stepped into the aisle between them with a gun at his side and an expression that Amara had never seen on a human face before. The expression of someone who had convinced themselves that what they were doing was justified. Cho Hyun-woo. She had met him dozens of times in her married life. He had always been polite to her. He had always been present at dinners, at events, at every important occasion, standing slightly behind Min-jae's shoulder, quiet, observant, efficient. She had always sensed something complicated behind his courtesy, but she had attributed it to the general wariness of men in Min-jae's circle toward the foreign wife who didn't fully understand the world she had married into. She understood now. "You should have kept running," he said. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking into his phone, giving orders in rapid Korean that she had learned enough of to partially follow. The jet, the airstrip, make sure, don't leave witnesses. And then he ended the call and turned to find Amara standing 5 feet away with a fire extinguisher in both hands. He stared at her. "That won't—" She swung. She was not, and had never been, a violent person. She believed in de-escalation. She believed in measured responses. She also believed, with absolute conviction, in surviving, and in making sure that she lived to board a morning flight home to an 18-month-old boy with his father's eyes. She put everything she believed about survival into that swing, and Hyun-woo went down hard, and the gun spun across the cabin floor. The forward door burst open. Min-jae took in the scene in about 1 second. Hyun-woo on the floor, Amara standing over him with a fire extinguisher, and her work uniform, and an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life. "You were supposed to stay in the lounge," he said. "I improvised," she said. He crossed the cabin in 4 strides. He stopped in front of her and took the fire extinguisher gently from her hands, which had started shaking now that the moment had passed, and set it aside. He looked at her face carefully. She let him. "You're all right?" he asked. "I'm all right." He nodded once. Then he looked down at Hyun-woo, who was conscious and staring up at both of them with an expression that had moved past strategy into something much more defeated. "How long?" Min-jae asked. He was very quiet. The quieter he got, the more dangerous he had always been. Hyun-woo said nothing. "How long were you planning this?" Still nothing. "The photographs," Min-jae said. "The men you sent. The attempt on her life." Each word landed with complete precision. "Did you think I would never find out?" "You were soft," Hyun-woo said finally, rough, bitter from the floor. "The moment you brought her in, you went soft. Everything your grandfather built, you were going to hand it away piece by piece because she smiled at you. Because she made you feel like a regular person." His voice twisted. "You had an empire." "I had a wife," Min-jae said. "I had a child I didn't know existed. I had a life." He crouched down so they were level, and his voice was very even. "And you took it. Not because of the empire, because of jealousy. Because you wanted something I had, and you couldn't stand that I had it." Hyun-woo looked away. Min-jae stood. He called 2 of his men. "Take him. I want him delivered to Prosecutor Oh's office by morning, intact." He paused. "Everything we've compiled. All of it. The fraud cases, the trafficking connections he's been running parallel to our operations, all of it. He'll spend the rest of his life in a courtroom." Hyun-woo's head came up. "You're turning me over to—" "Yes," Min-jae said simply. "I'm done with the other ways." In the silence that followed, Amara watched Kang Min-jae, the man they called the Black Dragon, the most feared figure in the Korean underworld, make a choice. Not because he had to. Not because the law left him no other option. But because he chose it. Because somewhere in the last several hours, at altitude, between a crystal glass, and a fire extinguisher, and the name of a child with his eyes. Something had shifted in him toward a version of himself he had nearly given up on. He turned to her. The rain was hammering the aircraft now. Beyond the windows, the tarmac shone. "I searched for you until I lost myself," he said. "Not performing it, not delivering it, just saying it, the way a tired person tells the truth. I found out about Hyunwoo and I built the case and I kept going, but I was empty. For 2 years." He paused. "I don't expect you to forgive me. The things I said that night, the way I looked at you, I know what that cost. I'm not asking you to pretend it didn't happen." "Then what are you asking?" she said. "Time," he said. "That's all. Time to show you a different version of what this could be." He searched her face. "We have a son. Whatever else is true, we have him, and he deserves to know his father. And I would like—" He stopped. Started again. "I would very much like the chance to be someone worth knowing." Amara looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the storm was passing. She could see it in the sky, the rain easing at the edge, the clouds beginning to break in one corner into something that wasn't yet light, but was the direction light was coming from. "1 week," she said. He went very still. "You get 1 week. You meet Eli. You behave like a human being and not a crime lord. And then we see." She held his gaze. "I'm not promising you anything. I'm not walking back into that world. And if I see one gun, one bodyguard standing too close to my son, one moment where I feel like we're in danger—" "You won't," he said. "I give you my word." "Your word," she said slowly, "is going to need some work." "I know," he said. "But," she said, and he went very still, "I'm willing to watch you work on it." The week became a month. The month became 3. It was not easy. Nothing about it was easy. Not the careful, halting conversations. Not the days when she remembered specific words he had said, and went cold and quiet, and needed him to simply sit nearby and say nothing. Not the nights when Eli, who had taken to Min Jae with the cheerful absolutism of a small child, who recognized something familiar in a stranger's eyes, asked why Appa had to leave and whether he was coming back. But Min Jae came back. Every time. He came back with less of the empire around him each time, disentangling himself from it methodically, piece by piece, handing legitimate holdings to people he trusted, cooperating with Prosecutor O in ways that had made him controversial in every circle he'd ever moved through. People said he had gone soft. People said the Black Dragon was finished. He did not care. He sat on the floor of Eli's room and built block towers that his son immediately demolished, and he learned the names of every character in the cartoons Eli watched, and he sat at Amara's kitchen table while she made coffee, and she asked him hard questions, and he answered them honestly, even when the honest answers were not flattering. Slowly, not quickly, not all at once, but with the particular stubbornness of something genuine, she began to believe him. Not everything. Not all at once. But enough. The aviation company opened 6 months after the night on the airstrip. It was legitimate. Entirely. Audited. Above board. The sort of business that generated paperwork rather than avoiding it. Min Jae had, it turned out, a genuine aptitude for logistics that had previously been applied to things that couldn't be discussed in meetings, and applying it to something legal was both more boring and more satisfying than he had expected. He stood on the tarmac of the new facility on the morning it opened, watching the first aircraft in the fleet taxi toward the runway, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Amara was walking toward him across the tarmac in the morning light. She was wearing her own clothes, not a uniform, not a costume, just herself. And she had her hands in the pockets of her jacket, and she wasn't smiling yet, but she was close. Beside her, holding her hand with the single-minded grip of a toddler who has decided a direction, was Eli. He was small and round-faced, and he had Min-jae's eyes, exactly as she had said. And when he saw his father standing on the tarmac, he dropped his mother's hand and ran. Min-jae caught him, lifted him in one motion, held him against his chest, and pressed his face briefly into the child's hair. Eli squirmed immediately because he was 18 months old, and squirming was essentially his occupation, and he pointed at the aircraft with tremendous authority. "Plane," he announced. "Yes," Min-jae said. His voice was not entirely steady. "That's our plane." Amara reached them and stood close, not tucked under his arm, not restored to exactly what they had been, but close, present, here. "It's a nice plane," she said. "You'd know," he said. She laughed. A real one. And he thought, standing on that tarmac in the early morning, with his son pointing at aircraft, and his wife standing beside him, choosing every day to be there, that he had ruled things and feared nothing and been feared in return. And none of it had ever felt like this. None of it had come anywhere close. For a man who had once ruled the shadows, love was the only kingdom that had ever asked anything real of him, the only one he had ever wanted to deserve. He was still working on that. He intended to keep working on it for a very long time. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere over the East China Sea alongside Amara and Min-jae, drop a comment below and tell us the moment that got you. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss another story. Every like tells us you want more, and every subscriber means another story gets told. We'll see you in the next one.